to everyone, and welcome back to Lori. It is so wonderful to be able to have a program like this where we get to read a book and then talk to the author, but to know that the author is a native, not just of Charleston, but of our community and our family. It allows us to shep more nachas, even so while reading the book. And, it was actually my high holiday read, Lori, over, in the moments when a rabbi has free on the high holidays, it was filled with reading The Rebel Daughter. And in thinking to this moment and welcoming you back home, right, virtually at least, was sort of this incredible dichotomy, right, which is that here, right, The Rebel Daughter is all about this intense moment in Jewish history, a moment of destruction, right? That's the frame, right? That moment of destruction around the destruction of the temple, and how the ironic it is, right? Because your relationship and your family's relationship to our community, to Emanu-El, is the opposite, is one of building, right? From being people who have founded this place, right, and who helped build Gordon Street, and who helped build the sisterhood, and served as president, and helped create Torah, right? We have a Banov Torah here at the shul as well. All of it just speaks to the dedication of your family. And now we have you representing us in the land of Israel, always knowing that we have that personal connection to it as well. And so for next year we celebrate our 75th anniversary, and we know that for all those 75 years, you and your family have been part of that, and just how beautiful and how incredible it is that we get to hold both those things in this moment, right? A family that built our, I know I'm not allowed to say temple because that's KKBE, but built our temple, right? While discussing a book, yes, a love story, but framed by a temple as well. And then lastly, before I give it back to Marsha, is just to point out to everyone else on the call, but how timely it is. I know that we've really been working hard to get you to talk to us, Lori, and a lot of different things, from COVID and some personal stuff, and your family kept us a couple times for meeting. But now, as we are able to do this, looking at the Jewish calendars, that we're only 2 days away from the 10th of Tevet, which is of course one of those markers in that story of the destruction of the temple, right? As we build up to the 9th of Av in the summer, there's these markers all along the way, and we're actually right at one of those markers now. And so we saw this day reflected in your book. Again, the love story is important, yes, but I'm focused on the, call me a rabbi, that's what I focus on, right? But just to note that it's still relevant, and we still discuss these things, these moments in our calendar today. So it was a wonderful book. It was a great read, and thank you, and thank you for being here with us, and for continuing to be part of Emanu-El. And as you said before everyone was let in the room, that you still see this place as your home, and we still see you as a child of our congregation.
Which,
well, thank
Rabbi
you very
Ravski,
much.
go please.
No, I'm just thrilled to be able to be here and see so many old friends and cousins, and everyone who I grew up with, and it's really so exciting for me. I mean, as I wrote you, I still remember my Hebrew school, Sunday school years very, very vividly. I was bat mitzvahed in Synagogue Emanu-El. I was confirmed. I was married in the shul. So I feel like the roots go deep. So even though I've been in Israel for 36 years and I love living here and very much consider myself Israeli, I also feel very, very connected to Charleston, and always will.
And one of the things that I would just add to Rabbi Ravski's remarks is, to this day, your family has put a fund in place the Edna and Milton Banov Adult Learning Fund, which people can continue to contribute to and to recognize on an ongoing basis the legacy of your family, which is just wonderful. Milton was our 5th president, and your dad became president, I think, almost to the day 25 years later. So it's a wonderful history. When we welcome, but by the way, Lori's life did not stop when she was bat mitzvahed and confirmed and married at Emanu-El. She did, as just a bit of history, get her undergraduate degree at Princeton, her MBA at Harvard, and then became a strategy consultant for high-tech companies before, at the age of, can I say it, 61,
Yes, sure.
became an author, which really tells all of us there are more careers in store for us. And in just moments, Professor Price is going to join us, and he is the professor of ancient history at Tel Aviv University and the author of books and articles on Greek and Roman history and Jewish history of the Hellenistic and Roman periods. He served as both the chair of the History and Classics Department at Tel Aviv University. And I think that, so that, along with the author notes, Lori, and his notes at the end of Rebel Daughter, it just punctuated how extraordinarily well researched this is. I believe you spent about 12 years researching it, everything from the children's games, how the garbage was disposed of in first century Jerusalem, and these obscure facts. But it really leads me to ask you, if I could, our first question, and that is, okay, after being in business and in high tech, what compelled you to write this book?
That's a good question. And many times during the research writing process, I asked myself that. I turned 50. I wanted just to go back to one of my early loves, which was creative writing. My husband and I had written the Boston Ice Cream Lover's Guide when we were in grad school. And we actually had a book contract to write the Dessert Lover's Guide to New York after that. And then in one of those sliding door moments of life, we made Aliyah and ended up moving to Israel, getting involved in the high-tech community here. And so our writing career kind of fell aside. And when I turned 50, I wanted to get back to it. And I feel like this story, which is a very compelling, I found it a very compelling love story. And it was a true story, a cast of fascinating characters, and this momentous time period. I felt like this story found me. And I started researching, and it became a bit of an obsession. I didn't think it would take 10 years to write, but I was working with Professor Price, and Jonathan will get on the call soon. He's unfortunately stuck.
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Hi, Jonathan.
I'm here. Yeah. I came.
So,
I heard all of the praise and kudos for your family, which only just increased the honor of my being here. I didn't want to interrupt you mid-sentence, but I just want to thank everybody. The 50 people who are here. I think the only one I actually know is Lori, and I see Deanie's on the call. But it's thrilling to be with you, and it never ceases to amaze me the wide interest, not just among my university students, but among the general public in Israel and in the world at large in this topic. Just this sort of interest, this almost hunger to know something. And actually, may I say something in the third person about Lori's writing process, why she stuck with it? Because it was a 10-year process. I was participant in some of it and witness of all of it, an obstacle for some of it as well, because I have a certain work pace, which is not a novelist's work pace. But as witness, I can say that another reason I think why Lori stuck with the story, and those of you who have read the book will understand this, is that Esther, during the course of the writing, at some point, Esther became a real person, and our questions changed from what would a 14-year-old girl have done or thought? What would Esther have done? To what did Esther do at this stage, and what did Esther actually do? So it was, I think, not just the story, but Esther herself, who was so vividly imagined by Lori and basically created by Lori. She became a real person. I know novelists talk about this, how their characters become real and compelling, and the characters lead the novelist rather than the novelist leading the characters. And there was really some point, I think, in the writing process in which that happened to Lori. And Esther and her compelling personality and story is what kept Lori going to the end.
And that really is, I did give our book club the opportunity, sort of just a bit of privilege, to send in questions in advance. And that gets to a question that a number of folks asked: is gender roles in first century Jerusalem. People were a bit surprised that you gave Esther the privilege, her learning from her dad that she had. Give us some perspective, if you would. What's truth and what just makes great fiction?
Mm-hmm. Okay, Jonathan, I think you should take that one.
Okay, I'll start this question. Lori should say something about it too, because she's actually thought long and hard about it and put her thoughts into the writing. I don't think there's a clear line between what's truth and what makes a good story. Maybe there's a line between truth and fiction, but fiction is based, good historical fiction is based on facts, as this is. I think that we, both of us, Lori as the writer and me as the historical, I would say advisor, but really nudge and harasser. We try to make everything in the book, and I mean everything down to the last detail, probable, not just possible, but probable. Esther is an unusual person. I think everything that she is and does and is portrayed as doing and thinking in the book is historically plausible. She may be extraordinary, but there are extraordinary characters in history. She's not, however, unique. In other words, there's not only one person who could have been Esther, and therefore it's not really historically plausible. So it depends on what parts of her you're asking about. Strong will, well, she was born with that, as girls were then as they are today. Of course, there are more outlets for strong-willed girls to become strong-willed and accomplished women now than then, but all avenues are not necessarily closed to her. It is not at all unrealistic that she was taught to read and write, especially since we have her in an aristocratic priestly family in which all children got an education. In fact, women, as you see Sarah in the book, were the main runners of the family. Our word economy means basically management of the house. It's a Greek word that means management of the house. And women in antiquity, in Greco-Roman antiquity, were in charge of the economy, that is the management of the house. So Esther, not only learning from her mother, but learning how to read and write, which was essential for managing the house, is very realistic as well. That she would express her will and ask to do things that boys would do. Again, I think I can't imagine that there weren't girls like that, and that there weren't fathers like Eliezer who were permissible and smiled on talented children and loved Esther. So I think that although she broke what we consider to be gender stereotypes, and she might have been unusual in her time, and she's pointed out by the characters in the book as unusual, she's not implausible or even historically unique.
The tombstone is so important in this book, and it gives us that foundation for surmising some of the other things. It certainly is fundamental to the love story. Could you speak a little bit about the finding of the tombstone and how that propelled the story forward?
Okay, I'll start, and then maybe Jonathan can fill in some more historical details. The stone was discovered near the Bay of Naples, and it was a very exciting finding for both archaeologists and scholars because it was the first physical proof that the Jews from Jerusalem were brought to Rome as slaves. And then, of course, there's this unique love story that the stone reveals. And there's just a few lines on the gravestone, but we can surmise a lot from those few lines. Jonathan, do you want to talk about how scholars interpreted this unusual inscription?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Do you want to, can I share the screen here? I can actually put up a picture of the tombstone. Okay,
That'd be great.
If you would enable me to share the screen, I'll actually put up a picture of it.
Joe Stern is our wizard behind the scenes, so.
You should be able to share now.
Oh, yes, I can. Thank you.
Sure.
Where is it? Here it is. Okay, do you see that? This is the stone. It's in fact a very modest piece of stone, which is broken on the left, as you see. And it has 3, 6, basically 9 lines of Latin. And this is the stone, which was, as Lori mentioned, discovered long ago. But those who discovered it were sort of scholars not interested in stories and sensation, really more technical aspects of the stone. It was published in a very obscure scholarly journal and repeated in scholarly journals in German and Italian particularly, but not really brought to public attention until recently, relatively recently, in the past 15 or 20 years. What this the story was unraveled from hints on the stone. This itself could be, reason why smut could be a lecture in itself, and I'll have to, this is an occupational hazard, I tend to lecture too long, but let me be very, very brief about the clues on the stone, okay? The first clue is her name, Claudia Aster, and it says that she's a Jerusalem captive. Now, if she's Jerusalem captive, we know that her name was not originally Claudia Aster, but this is and first of all, we know that she was a slave because all war captives are immediately slaves by ancient international law, whether she was the daughter of a farm worker or a high priest, she would have been a slave. And therefore, this was an acquired name that her master gave her after he freed her. We know that he freed her because his name is Claudius, and she has his name, Claudia. Masters gave their names invariably, always, their name when they freed them, plus a version of their old name. So her name, so she was captured, she was a prisoner from Jerusalem. It's first century, so it's 99.9% certain that she was captured in the siege of Jerusalem during 70. Her name became Claudia, Latin, and then Aster, which is a Latinization of Esther. So her name was Esther Bat so-and-so. We don't know what her father's name was because now she has a Latin name and she's freed by him. There are other clues here, but the really important one is the last one. It says that she was free, that she died at the age of 25. This very well could have been childbirth, which is a very common cause of death for young women in antiquity. Childbirth is always perilous, but in antiquity it was much more perilous. And women, unfortunately, many women died in agony in childbirth. It doesn't say that here. It sometimes does on ancient epitaphs, but the cause of death is not known. However, her age is below the legal age of the time for freeing slaves, for manumitting slaves. There were exceptions to that law. The Roman Empire tried to control manumission. They wanted to maintain the slave base throughout the empire. And for some reason, I could discuss that if you'd like, Romans were kind of manumission happy in this time. They were manumitting a lot of slaves, and the emperors were afraid that that would actually hurt the economy. So they forbade manumission of slaves below the age of 30, with some exceptions. And the exception, the law that could apply to Esther would be you free them for marriage. That not only evoked that he freed her to marry her, but that he freed her to marry because he loved her, because any other reason to have sexual relations with her, to use her for any purpose, even to have children with her, did not require freeing her and making her a Roman citizen. But he wanted to live with her as a Roman couple and have legitimate Roman children, which indicates emotion and love. Another indication of emotion is this part here, which he really is very worried about people harming Esther's grave. And the very fact of the stone, masters did not put up epitaphs for their freed slaves. This indicates a very special emotion. So it's not too much of a leap to hypothesize that Tiberius Claudius, who himself was a freedman and had experience of slavery, freed Esther. He was her last owner. He bought her, then he freed her because he loved her and wanted to marry her. And that's the basis of Lori's whole story.
Thank you.
There you go in a nutshell. Is that too fast?
No, thank you very much.
Now you see why it took me 10 years to write this book. Every time I had a question, we would spend months,
I'm sorry.
that
was short.
No, I'm kidding.
That was short. I'm sorry.
No,
Very
not at all.
enjoyable. No, very enjoyable.
Let's move if we could. And Lori, I know from our conversation just a few days ago, I mispronounced this name. I always want to say Josephus, and it's not Josephus. Thank you very much. I've been corrected, Josephus. Let's talk a little bit about him. We certainly know that he wrote an autobiography, a memoir of sorts, so we know what he says about himself. Did that make it easier or harder to write him? And also, what do we think? Was he a traitor to the Jewish people or not? What do you think?
I have his writings right over there. The big book on that shelf.
Josephus is such a great fictional character. He was a real historical figure as well, but for a novel, he's a great character because you really can't get a handle on him. To the people of his time in the first century, they did consider him a traitor. He was one of the leaders of the Jewish rebellion against Rome. He was made general of the forces of the Galilee, which was the most important military position because he was between the Romans and Jerusalem. And yet he was captured by the Romans after a battle where he was commander and he lost, taken to the Roman prison camp, and basically became friends with the Roman general and switched sides. So to the Jews of that time period, he was clearly a traitor. He went on to advise the Romans on how to conduct the siege of Jerusalem and how to basically destroy Jerusalem, all right, and help them win and put down the rebellion. And he went on to write the history of the conflict and the history of the Jews. He lived in the Roman emperor's old home in Rome with a very generous imperial pension. So clearly there are people who considered him a traitor. But when you look at it now, it's not so clear. Maybe he was a realist. I mean, when I look at this whole time period, I wonder, like, what were these people thinking in the first place to rebel against the greatest empire the world had ever seen? I mean, the Jews were in Judea, this remote province on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire, revolted against Rome, and they had no army. So, at some point you think, well, maybe Josephus was a brilliant statesman. Maybe he realized this was a lost cause and he was trying to negotiate better terms. So it's not clear. And Jonathan is one of the world's experts on Josephus. So even though I would like to talk about the book and the process, I feel like not to have Jonathan talk about Josephus is almost criminal, since he's
Lori, I was just going to say,
career.
Lori, one of the other stories that we know so well because of Josephus is the story of Masada, right? Is that he's the one who gives us that first century account, because he's there in the Roman camp, right? When you're looking down from Masada and you can see the square Roman camps surrounding Masada, we know that Josephus roamed those camps. Right, Masada takes place right after the destruction of Jerusalem. It's the last outpost of Jewish rebels that the Romans conquer and then end it. Sequel, I don't know. You can't continue with Esther, but Josephus. Another thing.
Right, but Josephus was not at Masada, and he was eyewitness to many of the events that he wrote about, but he was not actually there. And so that's an interesting one to talk about. And even the myth of Masada, which I say myth because I grew up with learning that the brave fighters at Masada decided to commit suicidal courage rather than be taken as slaves. And even in the early years of the state, the Israeli commanders were inducted into the army at Masada, and it was really held up to Israelis as something, a courageous bravery. And again, just like Josephus is getting a revisionist look from historians and people today, so is Masada. People are looking now and saying, well, they were actually murderous fanatics who were up there, and it was kind of senseless to commit suicide. They should have negotiated with the Romans. And you can see why that myth of being, resonated with Israel in the early days, the myth of Masada, being surrounded by these enemy forces. But I think now people are looking at Jewish history in a more sophisticated way, including Josephus's role and also Masada. So,
as we look back, go ahead. I'm sorry, Professor Price.
No, I maybe I shouldn't say anything because this requires you not have to drown out everybody about Josephus. But let me just say briefly that first of all, Josephus is in fact a fascinating and enigmatic character. He is endlessly attractive to both historians and novelists for both the same reason, which is that he is enigmatic and problematic as a person. And his life is also very well recorded. So there are really dozens of novels based on Josephus in many languages. I think in almost every European language, and in Hebrew, in Russian, there are original works of fiction about Josephus. It's like everyone trying to figure this guy out. And these novels started, these fiction started about 200 years ago or more. Also historians, there's the whole libraries on Josephus studies. Because he's so interesting, problematic, both generous with information, but also suspicious in everything he said. So instead of giving a mini lecture about Josephus, because Lori actually pretty much explained him, let me just make one point about Josephus and the enigmas. This applies both to Masada and to Josephus himself. One thing we should appreciate, this is more for historians, but also I think for general interest, is that for both problems that we've just now mentioned, Josephus, his life and character on the one hand, and Masada on the other hand, Josephus is the sole source of information. And what's interesting is that the tradition on Josephus, the historical interpretations of him, the novelistic interpretations of him, have used him against himself, have used him on Masada against his interpretation. For example, Masada. Josephus, you are absolutely right, Rabbi Ravski. He is the sole source. Without Josephus, we would not know. Archaeologists would have arrived at Masada, said, there's Roman siege here, the Jews lost. Let's put it down in the column of places besieged and lost by Jews. But the story of the other suicide is solely Josephus. What he writes the story in a contrary way to the Jewish heroic tradition. If you read his words, not between the lines, the plain meaning of his words in that story, in his account of it, Masada was an example of Jewish self-destructive fanaticism. That's Josephus. They had a mistaken religious view, apocalyptic view, and the only just and religiously and socially just end for them was in fact self-destruction. So he thought that they were the symbol of the hopelessness of Jewish fanaticism. That's how he told the story. It's not how it's told today, but that's exactly. So we take his facts, remove them from his context, and use them to tell our own story. The same thing, by the way, goes for Josephus himself. Everything that we use to condemn Josephus as a traitor, as a sneaky, conniving, plotting general, writer, Jew, and so forth, comes from Josephus himself. And of course, he doesn't present himself. He presents himself as a hero of the Jewish people. And everything he does, he justifies. He didn't change sides. He merely adjusted his religious belief. That is to say, we thought that the end of time, the Messiah was coming now. We were wrong. Now it's up to us, and me especially, as Yosef ben Matityahu, to instruct the Jewish people to stop rebelling because it's self-destructive. our time will come, but not now. He presents himself as a prophet. Everything he did was by God's command. This is how he said it. Of course, all this is forgotten when we write his biography as a traitor, but that's not how he presented it. And every detail that we use against him comes from his own pen. That is part of the great Josephine enigma.
Yeah, let's use the word self-destructive to launch into the next question. And that is, this book, Lori, is both a young adult novel and an adult novel. And I got a couple of questions from folks that said, wow, there are graphic descriptions on this that we wonder, is that appropriate in a young adult world? Maddie at one point was going to be castrated. How did you, when you were choosing these topics, decide how to position this for either a young adult or an adult or both?
That's a great question. I wrote this as an adult novel, and most of my readers by far are adults. The YA or young adult designation is purely I'd say a commercial marketing decision that Random House took because there was a need for Jewish historical fiction that was not about the Holocaust. That's what the editors told me at Random House. So I think it was just a question of where they wanted to put the book for maximum, I'd say, commercial success. So it was really a marketing decision, not an editorial decision. But in terms of the content, I like I said, I didn't expect this to be a young adult book, but apparently young adult books are very graphic and they deal with some pretty intense themes. So it does fit. One of the things that surprised me was that young people would be reading this book, which they are, and it's been sold was in thousands of school libraries. But also it's had a very warm reception in the Christian market, which was another thing that I wasn't expecting, with Christian readers who view the destruction of Jerusalem as a very important event in their own history. And of course, Christians during this time period considered themselves Jews, and the Jews considered them as part of the Jewish people. So our shared roots is something that is appealing to Christian readers. And actually the book became a finalist for the best Christian fiction novel of the year, the Christie, given by the Evangelical Christian Publishers Association, which very much surprised me. But they see this story as important for them too. And Josephus, we only really know about Josephus's works because it was the church that preserved them. It was the monks in the monasteries who were copying Josephus's works. The Jews in ancient times and antiquity were not that interested in what Josephus had to say. And I've spoken with many Christians who told me that they grew up in homes without books. They only had two books. They'd have the New Testament and the works of Josephus. So he's considered a very important figure also in for Christians. So the whole
may I add that one reason for that is that Josephus is the earliest source outside of the New Testament to mention Jesus, and it's a genuine mention of him. So Christians love him for that reason as well. Let me also say something about the uncomfortable scenes in the book. Lori's book actually, I think, comes. There are uncomfortably violent scenes. There are some scenes where you can almost smell the reek of the trash or the corpses or whatever. It's a very it's a book that also evokes the senses as well. But Lori's book, I think, comes in a kind of a latest wave or trend, which is a good trend in historical fiction on antiquity, and that is, think of the old dramas. Think of I, Claudius, if you know that series. This is a BBC salon drama. Beautiful. I think it's a brilliant thing, but it's antiseptic. They're in very clean sets. Everyone's toga is pressed, and you don't see the reality of ancient Rome. You don't see, Rome was a smelly place. It was a violent place. It was a dirty place. It was an unsanitary place. And the latest novels and also TV shows. I don't know if you've seen the series called Rome. Rome, you really, so many scenes in that series are dark and smoky and smelly, and people are unbathed, and you can almost smell them through the screen. This is, I think, an attempt in fiction, both in print and in film, to evoke the reality of ancient settings, ancient cities in particular, which were really unsanitary places and also very violent places. So Lori's book fits right in, I think, to this very good, I think, and corrective trend in historical fiction on ancient Rome, presenting the real messy reality as it was.
And, as we talk about violence, again, one of the questions I got from a number of folks in advance is we do all have a bias. We prefer to think of the Jewish people as the good guys and the Romans as the bad guys. The naivete of that is not lost on most of us. But certainly the rebels fighting and killing each other, the group that
the storehouses,
that destruction is, as Rabbi Ravski was saying, of the storehouses of food and the knife people, and in that you talk a little bit about how the followers of Jesus of Nazareth were a small group of another one of those groups, not quite as the same zealotry as perhaps others. But I guess the net of that diatribe is help get us straight on Jews killing Jews. That is painful.
And yet that was the reality. And I think one of the messages of this event, not necessarily my book, but one of the reasons why this story matters to us is that we see how fast dangerous ideologies can spread. We see what happens when there's this unchecked nationalism and this civil discord that leads to civil war. And, I struggled with this question, how much of this do I want to portray? Because as Jonathan repeatedly reminded me, this was not the Jews' finest hour. The reason the rabbis gave for the destruction of the temple is, in Hebrew, it's sinat chinam, which is basically brotherly hatred. And the Jews did burn each other's food stores and torture and kidnap each other and their families. And it shows the disintegration, basically, of society. And I think there's a message that is still in our national consciousness, even in Israel today. There's a lot of disagreement, obviously, and a lot of, there are many political parties, and yet somewhere in the back of the discord, and every once in a while you'll read it, is, we can only go so far, but to take up arms against each other is a red line. Jonathan, you want to talk about the historical?
Well, I there's not much that was so well put. I can't really improve on it very much. Let me just add a point to what Lori just said so well, and that is that eventually what happens in a state of civil war and what is portrayed there. And by the way, this is the most real, the most historically accurate thing that happens in the book. The Civil War, the most awful things are the most accurate things that happen, because they're documented by Josephus and Talmudic sources. But let me just say that eventually what happens is a shift in psychological state, because what you see in the awful Civil War portrayed in the book, and what we see, oh boy, very worrisome signs of in Israel today, are Jews redefining Jews. So now you have Jews and not real Jews, or you have insiders, you have actual Jews, Israelis, and not Jews and Israelis, even though they're all Jews, of course. And when you start redefining people who are in your own family, your own group, and brothers fought on opposite sides in the Civil War. In every Civil War that happens, in the American Civil War, there are brothers writing letters to the same parents. It happened in 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem as well. When you have families fighting on different, they have redefined each other as the enemy. The enemy worse, this Jew was worse an enemy than the Roman general. It's a psychological state that you live in, and that's what makes it so horrid and so awful, and also so desperately seeking a solution that always evades.
There are a number of hands that have gone up, And I am going to go with founders have their privilege. So I'm going to just spend a moment and give Charlotte the floor to ask a question.
It was a mistake. It might have been a mistake.
Oh, was it a mistake, Charlotte?
We saw Charlotte raise her hand electronically. Yes. We just wanted to give her a chance to ask a question if it wasn't a mistake.
Okay, Jane's telling us move on. Okay, Lydia, I think you had a question. Your hand was up at one point.
I did not. I think that was an accident. I'm sorry. So, but this is very interesting. So I'm enjoying it. Continue on.
Now, I know Janet had a question about a recipe.
That's for Lori.
Yes, somewhere in one of the reviews that I read, I don't remember where, but it talked about the olive mint tapenade. Was that from your book? And can you tell me about it? I made it. It was delicious.
So, food is an important part of Jewish culture, and it was 2,000 years ago as well. I have recipes on my website, which is just lorikaufmann.com, using foods that were traditional foods of that time period. I have a delicious red lentil soup with cumin and lemon and the olive tapenade, and there's some other recipes. And as we know, everything that's old kind of becomes new again. And a lot of the food that is in the book. And I did spend a lot of time researching what was eaten in those days, all the goat milk products, the cheeses, the pomegranates, the wheat, and I tried to gather an assortment of recipes that were authentic to that period. So take pictures of it and send it to me. I'd love to see.
It's all gone. We ate it all up. It was very good. It's very good.
Yes. Rabbi Ravski has a question.
So,
Sure.
So just the question is, as you're, the reading the narrative, it sort of gave me like a different perception, sort of like you and Professor Price were talking about, of what was going on behind those scenes during that historical period. So as someone who lives in Israel, and as you mentioned before, we let everyone in that you do live a little bit more north in Ra'anana, near Tel Aviv. But I'm wondering if, in the time since you've written the book, or while you're writing the book, if you went back and walked through Jerusalem and the city of David, and sort of looked at it and how that's changed your own perception living in Israel of what went on during those periods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely did go to Jerusalem a lot to do the research. And, it's almost this visceral punch to your gut when you're walking on the exact same stones that your characters walked on. And if you've been to Jerusalem, just one example, there's a museum called the Burnt House. It's the archaeological remains of an aristocratic house from this time period. And you go in and the walls are still blackened with the ash and the soot from the fire of the year 70. And there's a skeleton of a young woman on the floor, and she's holding an iron spear. And you can just imagine the scene of the Roman soldiers bursting into the home, a young woman in the kitchen, running to the stairway, trying to get away. The fire engulfs her and she perishes, and you're standing right there, and just a few inches away from this. This is really history coming alive. And one of the things that I felt it was important to do was to get the details of Jerusalem right, because I wanted to put the reader there. I wanted it to be like time travel, that you could feel the heat of the stones, through your sandals, your eyes burning from the smoke of the sacrifice, seeing the temple in the distance. And to recreate those details, I had to put myself there and feel the wind and feel the temperature and look at the light and go to these places. And there's something very emotional and very magical that happens when you're, right there. And I'm sure those of you who've been to Jerusalem and you've looked at the wall the Kotel for the first time, you know what I mean when I talk about that, that gut punch. Is as cynical as you may be, there's something that happens when you're standing in the same place of 2,000 years of Jewish history.
When you did that research, Lori, were there any ahas, any surprises, whether it was on the day in and day out, the use of herbs and the children's games, or some of the really pithy, historical facts? What surprised you the most?
I think that what surprised me was what we alluded to earlier, which is how much of what I was taught or what I thought I knew about ancient Jewish history was wrong. But I was also fascinated by a lot of the history that I learned, a lot of the concepts and things that I associated with Christian history, I found out were actually Jewish ideas, the belief in resurrection, and the stress on the apocalyptic beliefs of the people, that the kingdom of God is going to come and the Messiah is going to come and the dead will be resurrected. These were all ideas that I had associated with Christian theology, and to find out that they were actually Jewish, originally Jewish themes or beliefs was very surprising to me. And also the burial customs of the first century was something else that I was fascinated about. They didn't bury their dead in this time period. They were, the bodies were put in caves around Jerusalem. And then after a year, when the flesh decomposed, the bones were saved in limestone boxes. So that when the kingdom of God came and the dead were resurrected, people would have their bones again, which they obviously needed. And Jonathan has spent a good part of his career studying these bone boxes around Jerusalem, these ossuaries and the inscriptions on these boxes. But that's a fascinating, to me, that was a fascinating discovery for me, not for archaeologists.
Professor Price, a comment on that?
Yeah, I've spent too much of my time in musty caves, I think, looking at old bone boxes. But I will say that it's always exciting to discover a new one, even with one name on it. Usually the discoveries of new ossuaries, Jerusalem was surrounded by a 2-kilometer band of burial caves. There were probably thousands and thousands of people who were buried there to be found. We found several hundred, 600 or 700 inscriptions on them. But every time we find a new one with a name on it, even if it's just a name, it's usually not as dramatic as Esther's story. I have to admit, although I wouldn't admit this in a professional conference, but I admit to this friendly group that I get a little sort of thrill because, discovering a new Sarah or Jason or Isaac or whatever it is really recovering somebody from the dustbin of history. Even if it's just a name, or usually there's some biographical data on the inscription. This is a person who was lost and now is found again and will be forever. I mean, so long as libraries remain, we like to think they'll be eternal, or just as long as humanity survives. This person will now be part of the human record and was lost before. So for me, it's a little personal thrill of excitement to find a new person. Even if it's just a name and one or two details about his or her life.
Yeah, and we
say one thing without taking up too much time. No, go on. We'll go on with the next.
No,
question.
please,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that in addition to the burnt house, which Lori mentioned, is very dramatic. You sort of right back into the first century, basically to the day of the destruction when Jerusalem burned. Jerusalem is always, you asked the question about Jerusalem, walking Jerusalem, bringing it alive. Well, there are always new things being discovered here. Every time they make a new parking lot or building, they find new things. Among the things they found recently, a student of mine, in fact, found a street from the year 70, and he thinks that he found enough evidence, and I'm now convinced that this was the street where he found lots of different burned grains concentrated on this street. He thinks this is where the warehouses that were burnt were actually located. It's just south of the wall of the old city today. And that, Lori says, it's exciting to go in the burnt house and feel the heat of the fire. When you walk on those pavement stones and you see the burnt grains lying there, you can almost hear the scurrying of sandals on these stones, people running towards or away from the fire, screaming, whatever. It's endlessly exciting.
And by the way, the two of you have done a wonderful job of promoting our synagogue's trip to Israel in Hanukkah of 2022. So we couldn't have asked for a better promotional plug. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. We do have enough time probably for one or two questions, although I've got many more and I hear my phone dinging like crazy, which tells me there are more on my phone. Lisa Isaacson is smiling, so I'm betting they're from her. But are any other questions that anyone would like to ask?
Charlotte,
is your hand up still an error, or are we embarrassing you to ask a question?
Charlotte, you're unmuted if
You're
you need
unmuted.
to
You can
ask.
talk, Charlotte. Charlotte, can you hear us?
I think we're good. I think other questions. Gloria, do we hear you talking and you're on mute? No.
So Rita Kirstein wants to know if you're working on another book, Lori.
Yeah, that's a good question. I am working on another book, and it's actually based in Charleston. So I hope I'll be in Charleston more. Very, very loosely based on my grandmother and her sisters at the turn of the early 1900s. I would just love to have an excuse to come back to Charleston, and there's so much history right there. And I think the story of the Jews of Charleston is a fascinating story, and the way the Jewish community of the South has managed to retain its Jewish identity and yet be such an important part of the fabric of Charleston society is something that I think is a story it's a great story to tell. And it's also about identity. Are you a Jew? Are you a Southerner? Are you what does it take to be an American? How much do you have to leave behind to fit in? And those are all questions that I find fascinating. I hope it doesn't take another 10 years to write, but
well,
I will be down soon to talk to Dale and to try to get access to some of the great oral histories that I know a lot of you have participated in.
And we are taking that as a commitment well in advance. You're going to come to Synagogue. COVID will be in the rear view mirror. We're going to be able to do this in person. Sisterhood, and especially Linda Krawcheck, so wanted to have this in person in the social hall and have a brunch afterwards and whatever. And we just decided that, it was just better to be prudent. But we're taking you now at your commitment that you're going to come back for the next book. So
with love, of course.
Yeah.
And thank you again for having me. It was just wonderful. And I really appreciate all the support from the home team. And if I can just make one request, if any of you could leave a review on Amazon, it would just help so much. Each review is like gold. It boosts the book hundreds of places in the search algorithm. And even if you didn't buy the book, it doesn't matter from Amazon. But and it can just be one or two words. It's quantity, not quality. But if you have time, I'd really appreciate if anyone could do that.
absolutely.
And thank you for coming. I know it's hard on a Sunday.
We're so delighted that your mom was able to join us today.
Me
and
too.
Nancy, we thank you so much for all that you've done for the congregation. And we do hope you will visit.
I don't know how to think. I lost it. I don't know what I've done.
A question.
I've lost the sound and everything.
How can we access the recording for this?
I'm sorry, Fern?
How can we access the recording for this if we want to pass it on to somebody else? I'm in a study group at my synagogue in New York, and we're studying Jews in other cultures, and we'll be looking at Jews in the Roman culture of ancient Israel, and I wanted to know how we can access this session on the recording.
Joe, why don't you take that one?
I can put a "in case you missed it" type thing on our website at Emanu-El.com.
Okay, great.
Emanu-El.com.
Okay, I'll look on the
And we will also send out a link to it to all the participants today as well. So thank you for that question.
And
Great.
I'd also just like to say that Jonathan and I did a presentation under the auspices of the National Library of Israel, along with a noted early Christianity scholar, and that's online too, on the National Library of Israel's website and on my website. So if you want something more scholarly, that's on too.
Thank you very much. I hope you're seeing some of the comments in the chat where people are just sending accolades your way. So again, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you so much.
Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
day.
It was good to see you, Lori.
Always.
Thank you, Lori.
wonderful to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
כל הכבוד,
ביי.
תודה רבה.
תודה, תודה.